Welcome back, Hunters. Sky Sensei here with another build video. Okay, I swear this is one of the last chain crit videos for a bit. I think I've been having too much fun with this skill, and maybe it's because it fits my aggressive playstyle. But I know there's a lot of other skills to experiment with, and so I'll be trying those out after this video. I have mentioned in previous videos that Glaive is kind of on the border of being a viable weapon to use and combine with chain crit. So in this video, I'm going to show you guys a few builds for fire and ice glaives utilizing this skill. The element boost that you gain from chain crit is definitely worth. Plus 15 element is quite significant, but you also have to keep in mind that element is also kind of like the icing on top of our raw damage. In Sunbreak, these element damage have been boosted and we now have more slots available compared to base rise. So now we have the capability to really take advantage of these great elements. So in this video, there are 4 builds I'll be showing you guys, 2 fire and 2 ice. All 4 utilize chain crit. The first build of each element leans a little bit more into the element damage. These builds are designed for you to be aiming with precision on monster element weak zones. If you feel you are not proficient enough at hunting a certain monster though, my follow-up builds are for each element that are a little bit more raw focused, with element being the cherry on top rather than the icing on the cake. So these second builds are for you guys to practice hitting those narrow element hit zones, but still having good enough raw that in case you miss or you hit other body parts, you're still rewarded with some extra damage and can still hunt the monsters in a good time. The other options that you can use these second builds is basically when a monster has like really that one good element hit zone and all the others are kind of mediocre. So if you want to attack the body parts from all the other parts as well, then you can use these second builds to kind of have good raw damage there but still utilize the extra bonus element damage on that one good hit zone. An example of this is Rajang. Like Rajang has a really good ice hit zone on the head, but the rest of his body isn't that great, and sometimes it can be a little bit hard to hit that head. Now I won't go in too much detail here since this isn't the purpose of the video, but you should check out the chart in the hunter notes before deciding which build to use against a monster. Hit zone values above 20 are generally where element really starts to shine. Now as always, these builds are subject to your charm discretion. If you have better or worse charms than the one I showcase, you will have to change your build up a little bit. And with that, let's start with fire, shall we? So this is the critical element fire build. We are utilizing the Rathalos blade. Great fire damage at 50 base damage. Leans a little bit into the purple sharpness. No affinity unfortunately, but we do have a decent raw damage of 320. Also a good level 2 deco slot and a level 3 rampage deco slot, which will actually be really helpful for this build to obtain higher crit rates. Now looking into the armor, we do have the Kaiser Crown, Archfiend Final Boss Armor, Aurora Somnicanth Braces, the Archfiend Coils, and the Ingot Greaves. Looking at the skills, we have 5 Critical Eye inherently from the Teal Helmet and the Ingot Legs. That shoots us straight to 25% affinity. In addition, we also have Weakness Exploit, which is important with element builds. You must target weak zones, and most element weak zones are also weak to raw, meaning you will have a higher chance to crit on these body parts. To finalize the crit rate, I also added the Kushala Soul Rampage decoration to the blade. This is the Rampage deco slot that I was talking about. Since this is a chain crit build, you will be focusing on multi-hits either in the air or on the ground, so quite frequently you'll have Kushala's skill just activate on its own and provide you with 15% more affinity, bringing the total on this build on weak hit zones to 90% critical rate. So with that, we'll be taking advantage of those critical hits with crit element 3, which is maxed out on the gloves with the addition of a 4-slot crit element deco. Now as it sounds, critical element does add 15% more damage to the element damage associated with your critical hits. So with Sunbreak, we were able to fit this into the build without giving up too many of the other skills, and since we have a high crit on this build, it's definitely worth it. Now the other skills we have on this build, critical boost is maxed out as well because, as I previously mentioned, while element is a great icing on the cake, raw damage is still the base for most of your damage, and since this build has a high crit rate, you might as well boost that raw damage to get that extra damage in. We also have fire attack maxed out on the single slots of the build. The Teo helmet is absolutely great for element builds because it has those 3 single slots, perfect for element jewels. Chain crit is of course maxed out from the armor, and finally I added Master Touch as well. Now this blade has purple sharpness, not a lot but a decent amount. Since the build has a crit rate at minimum 75% and max at 90%, Master Touch was definitely the way to go, and you should also be aiming for only weak spots, so hitting anything else with element weapons is kind of a waste of damage. Purple Sharpness actually applies a 25% multiplier to element damage, so again further boosting our element damage in this build. So if you can be precise and land your hits on the monster weak zones, you will be rewarded by being able to retain that Purple Sharpness boost for a longer period of time. White Sharpness drops this boost to about a 15% multiplier, so it's definitely worth maintaining that purple as long as possible. So yeah, that's it for the first build, guys. It's a great fire build and deals quite a bit of damage, but again, it leans into critical element quite a bit. So if you're hunting monsters with lower element hit zones or very limited or hard to reach hit zones, I would suggest this second fire build. Armor wise, we change up the gloves to the Rathalos gloves and the greaves to the Shigaru Magala greaves. Skills wise, what this changes is that it gives us the ability to max out attack boost at level 7 thanks to the 2-slot deco on the weapon. Fire attack drops just a little bit, and Master Touch is unfortunately replaced with Razor Sharp, but because of the greaves, we gain the skill Bloodlust. Now Bloodlust is an interesting skill which immediately inflicts you with Magala's virus, but if you deal enough hits before the virus meter fills up, you actually cleanse yourself. During the infected period, you lose health over time, but your attack is boosted and your stamina use is reduced. When you are cleansed, your red health is restored and your affinity is boosted by 20%. A whole 20%. And that lasts for a whole minute. So during this time with this build, on top of Weakness Exploit and Critical Eye and Kushala's Soul Rampage deco, you actually hit 100% affinity on weak body parts, which is what you should be aiming for max damage. So as I mentioned before, this build doesn't lean into element as much, but we still have a little bit and we've kind of boosted that fire damage, so it's kind of like the cherry on top. When you're fighting a monster that is weak to fire, you can deal large raw damage with 100% affinity and get that fire right on top to just kind of push your damage over the edge. Now there is a second blade that I can recommend for this second build, the Espinas Rosenspringen. It's a very cool looking blade, might not be just as much damage, it's probably a little bit lower. The fire damage is about half, but we aren't leaning into that fire damage as much. It has a base affinity of 20%, so even without Kushala's Soul Rampage deco, you still hit 100% affinity with this build. All you really need to do is swap out the weapons. You lose the extra attack jewel from the Rathalos blade, but you can now slot in a single fire jewel onto the Espinas blade. So it does bring element a little bit up. You can also slot in a new Rampage deco, any of the specific anti-monster decos, which will then give you some bonus damage to make up for the loss of attack. So overall, not too much of a change. It's just really if you want to use another cool blade, because this blade looks freaking awesome. Now the Ice Glaives are a little bit more rough in terms of affinity, but the Aurora Somnicanth Ice Glaive has a great ice damage at 57 base element. Raw damage is again at 320, which is again adequate for an element blade. Sadly, 0% affinity again, and we don't have the nice level 2 deco slot like the Fire Rathalos blade. Nor do we have the 3-slot Rampage deco, so this is going to change things up quite a bit. So starting with the crit element build, we have the Kaiser Helmet, 2 Archfiend chests and coils again, the Espinas Embraces, and the Shigaru Magala greaves yet again. So in terms of skills, we can max out ice attack with the 2 single slots on the weapon and 3 on Tio's helmet. Attack boost sits at level 4. Again, this could be better with better charms, but because we lost that level 2 deco slot from the other weapon compared to the Rathalos blade, this ice blade does suffer with a little less attack. But it's still definitely one of the best ice glaives by a long shot. With Critical Eye, Weakness Exploit, and Bloodlust again on the legs, our affinity is up to 85% during the virus recovery phases, which is still pretty good and it leaves a lot of room to damage, and take advantage of that critical element maxed out with the addition of the level 4 critical element jewel on the gloves and the level 2 on the coils. So again, because we're leaning into element, this build doesn't leave a lot of room for error. So if you're not comfortable with the hunt to the point that you know you're gonna miss some good hit zones, I would recommend using the second build until you are more efficient at the hunt. Chain crit is also maxed as expected, but what's new is the gloves. We're using the Espinas gloves particularly for protective polish too. Now this blade has no purple sharpness on base, so we're only using protective polish to give you that 1 minute of protection after any sharpen. White sharpness has a 15% element multiplier, so it's still very good to maintain. So I would definitely make sure that anytime you're entering a new hunt or you're entering a new transition, make sure to sharpen, get that protective polish before you start the battle. Besides that, there are a couple strangler skills on this build which could help. I also added a level 1 grinder jewel to my charm if you have a slot on your charm. Since this blade doesn't have a lot of white sharpness, you will have to probably sharpen at some point after protective polish runs out. Now for the second ice build, this one doesn't lean into ice element as much again. You can use the same glaive, although I recommend changing to the Lunagaren blade. Just like the Espinas blade, this one has less than half the element damage, but this time it actually has an increase in raw damage. So since this build is more raw focused with ice element being the cherry on top, this build outputs a shit ton of damage, plus it has a ridiculous amount of purple sharpness. With this build, you can get well over 100 hits and still have purple sharpness left over. The affinity on this build is the same since we use the same crit eye, Wex, and Bloodlust. Your attack can be boosted though since we have the change in the gloves to the Rathalos gloves, which adds to attack. The legs are still the Magala legs, but without crit element we can free up a slot to max out Razor Sharp, which prevents sharpness loss for 50% of your hits. So we gave in the protective polish, but we got max Razor Sharp. So again, the Razor Sharp with all the purple that we have on this build, you're going to be getting big raw damage for quite a while. Quite honestly, I prefer this one over the previous one. Even though the last one technically has higher ice damage, the white sharpness is a little bit of a pain in the butt to kind of like manage. So this purple sharpness is way more comfy. So those are the 4 builds, guys. A final note that I would like to make for all the builds, you should also consider the Kinsect choice. If you guys don't know, blunt Kinsects do not apply element damage. Only Sever Kinsects can do this. So if you're fighting a monster with good element hit zones, I would consider using a speed Sever Kinsect. You can be very accurate with the speed Kinsects and get them to apply element damage to specific body parts. If you would like a recommendation on how to use speed Kinsects with chain crit, please check out my previous video in the card at the top right. Powder Kinsects are also a great option because they attempt to hit the body on the marked spot as much as possible. Assist Kinsects will definitely be on the lower end in terms of precision. They usually follow your heavy attacks at the end of combos and it'll take a little bit of a wider swing around your glaive. So it's not as accurate, but it's not terrible either. It really just depends on the geometry and the attack angle that you take against the monster. So that's it for the Fire and Ice Chain Crit Glaive builds. Fantastic builds that I've been running great in multi-hunts. I've done my best to balance some sharpness with the attack skills as well. These are definitely not the most mathematically highest DPS builds, I would say, but they are fairly efficient builds because extending the purple sharpness on the Rathalos or maintaining the white on the Somnicanth blade is quite important in hunts. The sharpness multipliers affect both element and raw damage, so even if you're losing just a little bit of damage from the jewels, maintaining that sharpness ups your damage and keeps you on par with the lacking attack jewels. So that's it for me, hunters. I hope you guys enjoy these builds. Let me know if you give them a try. If you guys are using different weapons for ice and fire, let me know in the comments below. I really like these two, so I just went ahead and built them. I'm currently working on thunder and water builds next, so I'll keep you guys updated. So until next time, friends, stay safe, be happy, and keep hunting. Sky Sensei is out.